Anybody except Heike know German? What is Baum? Does anybody know what the Baum is in German?
Tree. Build.
A tree.
Tree. Oh.
Yes. So this is the family tree, Stammbaum, of the Uri family. This is the 5 generations, and what we're trying to tell you is, why can we tell this story? Now, many people have said to me, I wish I'd asked my grandparents more questions about where we came from. And in many cases, of course, it's too late. But in our case, we have amazing records, and you'll see as the talk goes forward. Why do we have such wonderful records? Well, first of all, one family lived in Berlin for 174 years. The Germans, as we know, kept excellent records. They kept excellent records of their good deeds and their bad deeds, but they kept wonderful records which helped us. Another reason we know a lot about this family is that my grandfather's sister, and her name was Elsa Uri, she was a very famous author of children's books. She sold over 7 million books between 1900 and 1930. And her biographers have done a lot of the spade work for us, and that's why we know so much about her and the family. We also are lucky enough to have 200 letters. They were written from Berlin and later from Amsterdam, detailing what it was like from 36 to 43 as the Nazis tightened the noose. And in those letters, which I've read and they're very moving, you can see how desperate the Jews were getting as the Nazis tightened the noose. And finally, we have my grandfather Ludwig, who you'll meet with his wonderful moustache. And Ludwig was managed to get out of Germany in 1939. How did he get out? Well, my father, Fritz, was already settled in England, nothing to do with Hitler. Way before Hitler, he left Germany for business reasons. So he got my grandfather out. And there my grandfather Ludwig sat for 24 years in exile. He was 69 when he left Germany. And he decided to write a very gossipy account of every member of the family that he could record. So, for example, he mentions his cousin Louis, who was a doctor, and his brother, who was a doctor. And he says they were wonderful doctors, but they died in their mid-30s because they were womanizers, and they died of syphilis. So this is pretty amazing details that we get. So thank you, Grandpa, for all that information. When we get to the Holocaust, it's very important for us to remember how the Jews have been perceived for 1,000 years. And let's look at it. You can see the illustration on the top left. That's a typical illustration from the 18th century of a Jew, a pawnbroker, or some sort of peddler peddling his wares. On the bottom left is, of course, a Nazi illustration of the greedy Jew putting his hand out. So you have to remember that the Jews were always outsiders for 1,000 years. Never quite belonged. They were a bit like the gypsies. They were tolerated, but sometimes they were expelled, and sometimes they were given privileges. But they never felt secure, and they were pawnbrokers, peddlers, cattle dealers. They were the wandering Jew. Every Sunday, the priests would remind their congregation, the average German, who had killed Christ. And who do you think killed Christ? The Jews. So, and worse of all, they still didn't acknowledge Christ as their Savior. The Jews also spoke a strange mixture of German and Hebrew, Yiddish, which we all know of. But Des and I have discovered that Yiddish is actually 70% German. So to the German ear, Yiddish sounded rather strange, a sort of bastardized German. And they also wore strange clothes, and they had, of course, the payas. So the Jews were kind of strange, exotic creatures, and they were distrusted. I want to also say at this point that anti-Semitism was always bubbling below the surface. And although the Jews sometimes forgot this, there was always this feeling that somehow or other they were different. There was an invisible wall. By the way, that's the name of a book, The Invisible Wall, which I recommend. Give you some early family history. There were no Jews allowed in Berlin until 1660, none at all. In 1712, the ruler of Prussia, remember there was no Germany at the time, the ruler of Prussia said to the Jews, you can build an inconspicuous synagogue. And what do we mean by inconspicuous? Well, what we mean is that the King Frederick, or the Kaiser Frederick II said, you can build your synagogue, but its top of the synagogue should be no higher than the houses on the same street. So the Jewish elders, in their wisdom, started the foundations way below street level, and they could comply with the Kaiser. But as is normal in those days, when something was given to the Jews, something was taken away. In this case, Frederick said, only the 200 richest Jewish families can stay in Berlin, and the others have 4 weeks to pack up and leave. So there was a steady influx of Jews from the east. About 1743, there were about 2,000 Jews in Berlin, and by 1780, there were about 7,000 Jews in Berlin. But at this point, there's a very momentous episode in the history of the Uri family, and that is that in 1770, if you look up at the screen, Hirsch Schlesinger, who was my grandfather's great-grandfather, came in from Czech, what is now Czech Republic, and he came from Hotzenplotz. Well, Des and I started giggling when we heard Hotzenplotz. We thought, there can't be a place called Hotzenplotz. But we looked it up, and yes, it's actually a place, Osoblawa, which is another name in Czech for the same place. So anyway, Hirsch comes in from Hotzenplotz, and we know that he had to come through a special gate into the city. And this was the Rosenthaler Gate. And how do we know he came through the Rosenthaler Gate? Well, it was reserved for Jews and for cattle. So now you have an idea of what the Germans thought of the Jews. German, cattle, and Jews. Anyway, Hirsch was he was 20 at the time. He came to the north of Berlin, and he opened up a second-hand men's store. And there are many stories my grandfather Ludwig tells about Hirsch, and one of them is about his shady business practices. What he used to do was when the factories closed at about 5 o'clock, he would try to get the workers into the store, and he would say to his employees, Mach Laila. And if you know some Hebrew, Laila, of course, is night. And he would draw the curtains and make it dark so that the customers couldn't examine the second-hand clothes too closely. That was old Hirsch. But he was traditional Jew, he was a member of the synagogue, and there's a plaque about him in Berlin. The next 100 or so years we call the Jewish utopia. And what we're trying to do, Des and I, in this talk, is show you not just about the Holocaust, but actually the German Jews had some wonderful, wonderful years where they flourished. You see, in 1790, those who know the history, there was the French Revolution. And the French Revolution preached the brotherhood of man. And fortunately for the Jews, they were part of this. And instead of people looking down on the Jews, there was tolerance in the air. And the Jews benefited from this. Jews could now become German citizens. And in fact, Hirsch Schlesinger's son-in-law, Levin, actually became a citizen of Berlin in 1826. Now, it's hard for us sitting here today in Florida to understand how momentous that was to become a citizen of another country. I was last week in Romania, and was in the synagogue in Romania, by the way, which had a huge Jewish population, nearly 1 million people, and the Gabbai said to me, he said, the first Jew to become a Romanian citizen was not till 1910. So in that way, for Hirsch, his son-in-law Levin, to become a citizen was an amazing thing. Now Levin Yuri was, Grandpa writes, he gave everything he had to the poor. And so much so that at his funeral, the Jewish poor from Berlin all came to his funeral. There were long lines of the Jewish poor. He was traditionally religious, and one of the things they tell about Levin is that he was madly in love with Hirsch Lesinger's daughter, Hanschen. And when they said to Levin, we're going to bury you in the distinguished part of the Jewish cemetery, he said, no, if you can't bury Hanschen, and by the way, that part of the cemetery was forbidden to women, he said, if you can't bury me next to Hanschen, then I don't want that honor. I want to be buried next to Hanschen. So at this time, the Jews rose to the highest levels of society. And if you look on the right, that is a person called Rachel Levin. And Rachel Levin was a Jewish hostess who had a salon. And those of you who perhaps know what a salon is, every Sunday she would open her house and garden to the distinguished cream of society, Jews and non-Jews alike. So you had aristocrats, politicians, writers, poets. Everybody came to Rachel's salon. And Rachel herself married a non-Jew, a Gentile aristocrat, and she was known as Baroness something. But anyway, she was very, very assimilated, as many of the Jews were. Now I'm going to read you from a book which I really recommend, which is called The Pity of It All, which is the history of German Jews. In the fall of 1743, a 14-year-old boy entered Berlin at the Rosenthaler Gate, the only gate in the city wall through which Jews and cattle were allowed to pass. The boy had arrived from his hometown of Dessau, some 100 miles away, in the small independent principality of Dessau. For 5 or 6 days, he had walked through the hilly country to reach the Prussian capital. And there is an entry that day in the gatekeeper's book. Remember, you could only get into the city through the gate, and the gatekeeper wrote, today there passed 6 oxen, 7 swine, and a Jew. So there you go. That person, and I'm sure some of you may have guessed it, was actually Moses Mendelssohn. Has anybody heard of Moses Mendelssohn?
Yeah.
I'm sure you have. So Moses Mendelssohn was, he came to Berlin penniless to work with the rabbi, but he said to the Jews, you have to give up your medieval ways, you should dress differently, you should speak German, and you should reform your religion. And Moses Mendelssohn was actually the grandfather of the composer, I wish Judy Drucker were here, she was of course, the grandfather of Felix Mendelssohn. Anyway, Moses Mendelssohn, what he really said was, you could be a Jew at home, and you could be a German in the street. And this was a problem that the German Jews struggled with for well over 100 years. Were they Germans of Jewish descent, or were they Jews who happened to live in Germany? Very, very difficult struggle. We talked about the Jewish utopia. I'd like you all, if you would, to look at the top left-hand illustration. Does everybody see it? Can you see it? Yeah. So on the left is a menorah. Do you see the menorah there on the left? And do you see it morphing into a Christmas tree?
Yes.
Well, that tells the story of assimilation. Just that one illustration. A bush, a Hanukkah bush, whatever you want to call it, but there it is. And religion was left behind in those years, 1790 to 1870. 50% into marriage, which may sound actually familiar because I think that the statistic isn't far different today. But there was mass conversions. It was very easy to convert. It was a 5-minute thing. You just said, I do, and that was it. And it was pretty cheap. So that there were the Jews. They celebrated Christmas with their neighbors, and they were integrated. And they had this comfortable middle-class existence, which grandfather writes about. They felt very at home in Germany. However, in 1819, there broke out an anti-Semitic riot, and that was called the Hep Hep riots. And this started in Bavaria, and the Jewish property was destroyed, and some Jews were killed. And if you remember Rachel Levin from the previous slide, she was absolutely devastated that she thought she was assimilated, she was Jewish, she was German, and she said this following thing. She says, there is a deeper malaise in German society and in the German soul about the Jews than she ever thought. It's a big surprise to Rachel Levin. Bottom left is a very famous Jewish German poet, and his name was Heinrich Heine. He was a romantic poet, and Heinrich Heine said something which sent shivers down my spine. What did he say after the Hep Hep riots? He said, where they burn books, and don't forget in Bavaria they've been burning German books, they will soon be burning people. And if you think of it, he said that well over 100 years before Hitler. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the contribution of Jews to German life. I won't go through every name, but just a few that stand out. Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Kafka, when he was Czech, Gustav Mahler, and Karl Marx. And it goes on and on and on. And the Jews were absolutely foremost in literature and music, science, and in business. One thing I'd like to ask you is, how many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof? Everybody? I'm sure most of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof. Well, if you remember, Tevye was a milkman. Remember, with 5 unmarried daughters? And he talked to God, remember that? Well, Tevye lived, I think, either in the Ukraine or in Russia somewhere. And remember, it was a very difficult existence. They were poor, and they were subject to the pogroms and being killed by the Russians whenever they decided to attack them. Well, I want to just to juxtapose that and say, at the same time as Tevye was talking to God and milking his cows, the German Jews were going to the opera. What a contrast between two different, at the same time, different civilizations. How do we explain this flowering of the Jewish community and all these famous people? And Albert Einstein humorously said, he said, the Jews have been waiting 2,000 years to sit the entrance exam to university. That was what he thought, why the pent-up feeling of the Jews to show what they could do, and they shone in so many areas. By the way, I didn't say this, but if there are any questions or comments, could you please keep it to the end? because, otherwise we get interrupted. And another thing I'd like to ask you is if, at the end, you do have questions, could we try to avoid some political comments, because I find that when we give this talk, the politics of today takes away from the enormity of the Holocaust. So please do me a favor and let's try to keep politics out of it. Anyway, as I said, the German Jews made huge contributions to German society. Here's the family. The top two are the grandsons of Hirsch Schlesinger, who you remember came from Hotzenplotz. And they had 4 children. On the left is Grandpa Ludwig with his famous moustache, Grandfather Gosse. On his right is Hans, who was his younger brother, who was a doctor, a gastroenterologist. Then there's Elsa, the writer who sold 7 million books, and then her younger sister, Käthe, who was a teacher. Now I'm going to hand over to Des, who'll tell you about Elsa.
I'm going to come forward because otherwise nobody will see me. Good afternoon. As John's assistant, I am going to tell the story about the 2 younger siblings, Elsa Yuri, the famous author, and Käthe, the teacher, whom you saw on the previous slide. But I'd just like to mention how significant it was that in this generation of German Jews, they were all professional, which was a real landmark for the Jews in Germany at that time. And if you recall Ludwig with his moustache, he was a lawyer who was fairly significantly famous in his own city. Then came Hans the doctor, then came Elsa the lawyer, and then Käthe the teacher. So everybody was pretty professional. And just to talk about Elsa first, who was the most famous of the 4 siblings, she, as John had told you, wrote children's books. Between 1900 and 1930, she wrote 10 volumes of books for little girls. And she was raised in this cultured, upper middle class family, and generations of young girls and women read her books. The books were for little girls. Now, amazingly, before the talk, Heike told us how she had read these books in Germany. Something we really didn't know before we came here this morning. And another interesting thing about the books and how widespread they were is what we heard in 2017 when John and I visited Berlin and we went to the Wannsee Museum, which was a conference of 1942 with the final solution by Eichmann and his henchmen. Right now, this is a museum, and the directors and librarians were absolutely amazed that a descendant of Elsa Yuri, namely John, was visiting. And the librarian, who was in her 40s, said to us, "I can't believe this." She said, "I read the books, my mother read her books, my grandmother read her books." So it became very much alive for us as we were researching the project to do this presentation. And the heroine, I think, kind of needs a little mention. The heroine of the book was a little Aryan girl, blue eyes, blonde hair, lived in a privileged German home, daughter of a doctor, and she traces her life from little girl playing with her dolls to adolescence to growing up, and she actually becomes a doctor. And a couple of speculative things that we do as we go through these talks every time, we kind of think of a few other little items of speculation. Was Elsa Yuri transposing her own privileged German life to this little girl that she wrote about? Was this little girl who became a doctor at a time when Jews and women were barely accepted into universities? So we just have this little thought that is interesting. So in 1926, it was rumored that Elsa Yuri wasn't writing any more books. And she was so beloved by these generations of little girls and women. She had written 6 volumes, and there was actually a national outcry, and she wrote 4 more volumes. So we look at who she was, a very, very nationalistic, patriotic, assimilated Jewish woman, more German than Jewish. And we wonder, when all the happenings took place after 1933, after Hitler came to power, and there were all sorts of rumors and talk about what was happening. Was she politically naive? Or was she, as so many German Jewish people, in denial? Because it's interesting that nowhere in her books, in the flaps of her covers, about the author was it ever mentioned that she was of Jewish origin and that she was Jewish. And so now 3 very dramatic things happened when Hitler came to power in 1933. Very, very rapidly. She was expelled from the Writers' Guild for being Jewish. She was rounded up and put in a Jewish hostel, as many Jews were rounded up in different parts of Eastern Europe and Europe. And we actually saw this hostel when we visited Germany. Why do I mention the address? You're going to see in a few slides later. It was 10 Sollingerstrasse. That was the address of the hostel, a small corner building where many, many, many Jewish families were rounded up and crowded into this hostel before the 3rd thing that happened. They were shipped in cattle cars to Auschwitz. And it makes us shudder, actually, when we've heard from John about Moses Mendelssohn, about his grandfather from Hotzenplotz, who came through a gate reserved for cattle and Jews. So now we just think again, imagining, or unbelievable to think, of something like this ever happening to a famous author of Judy Blume fame in the United States, A.J. Milne, who wrote Winnie the Pooh, or J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter fame. Incredible to even conceive of people of this category and fame being shipped off to be murdered because of their religion. Fast forward 40 years. Elsa Uri was murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. 1983, way after the war, a TV series is being made about her books. The fame was just incredible. And there was a TV series in Germany, immensely popular, and again, 40 years later, nowhere was it mentioned that she was Jewish or what her ultimate fate had been. And now, fortunately, she is memorialized. And again, during our visit in 2017 to Berlin, we see a street named after her, Elsa Uri Burgen, John standing underneath the archway, her books being sold in bookstores in Germany, and there's a library that is named after her in Berlin. So certainly with plaques, with memorials, she is now remembered. And here we come to a very moving part of our documentation. As John mentioned right at the beginning of the talk, we're very fortunate to have many documents and records. And let's look first at the house. I'm trying to get the pointer, but we see at the bottom of this slide a beautiful home. She amassed quite a bit of money in her day and selling her books. And she had a house in the mountains where she retreated and entertained family and friends. And the moment that she was shipped off to Auschwitz, we have a document from the Germans legitimizing why they were able to appropriate her home. And the reason that's documented is that the owner abandoned her house. If we look in the top right, we see again the Germans and their immaculate records. That is the inventory of what was stolen from her home. The inventory of her possessions, her furnishings, her clothing, up to the last pair of shoes, the upper right. The lower left is a transport list. And we have a lot of these documents in these books that we have on the table, if anybody wishes to look at it afterwards. Also, Yuri's name is highlighted in red. This must have been the last of many, many pages of the Jews who were transported on that particular day, the 12th of January, 1943. And what it says, it's difficult to see, and we've actually kept it in its unrecovered manner in the documents. It says, 12th of January, 1943, Elza Yuri on the transport list. The top picture of the suitcase is probably the most moving of this whole presentation. We, as Jewish people, non-Jewish people who have been to Holocaust museums, have images of piles and piles of shoes, of spectacles, of suitcases. We know that the Jews were told they were being resettled and that they could take one suitcase with possessions with them. For those of us who have seen Schindler's List, there's a very amazing memory that I think we recall of the Jews being shipped in a closed, windowless cattle car, and the Nazis, as the train is pulling out of the station, are opening the suitcases and taking their valuables. In 1995, a group of German school children were visiting Auschwitz on a field trip. Amazingly, this suitcase, amongst the piles and masses of suitcases on display, the suitcase was turned in a way where her name and her address at the hostel was visible. And one of the young girls on the field trip who had read her books exclaimed, "There is Elza Yuri's suitcase." Well, the upshot is that the suitcase was retrieved, it's been treated, and it is currently under lock and key in Auschwitz, not actually in full view of the museum, but it is locked away on the second floor in a building in Auschwitz. And when we visited in 2017, the curator of the archives opened up the building, the floor, and the drawer where the suitcase was housed. She pulled open the drawer, we put on gloves, and we were actually able, in most amazingly emotional moment, to touch and open the suitcase. Things happen very serendipitously. We are busy doing these presentations at various places, and in July, we were notified through the family, John's family, that the New York Times was going to be having a series on people who were overlooked and didn't have an obituary. And who was featured just 2 months ago, on July 15, 2019, in the New York Times, a half page of history and writing and an abbreviated biography of Elza Yuri. And so this is what it stated: overlooked no more. Elza Yuri's book survived World War II. She did not. Yuri's books about a German girl was so beloved, readers clung to them through the upheaval of World War II and passed them on to their children. But few knew, as we've said before, that the author had died in Auschwitz. I'm going to move on to the youngest sibling, Kada. Kada was the teacher, as you may recall. She was married to a very German, Jewish gentleman who had fought in World War I, had got an Iron Cross, who was a civil servant in Berlin, who did not, under any circumstances, believe that anything would happen to the Jews. They would be protected because of his history. Unfortunately, that was not the case. If we look at the picture on the right, there are 3 children. The one in the middle is Lisbeth, and she's the oldest daughter of Kada and Hugo, and she and her husband and young son, who was about 11 at the time, were able to move to Amsterdam, relocating her husband's business. And eventually, Peter and Hugo were persuaded to go to Amsterdam, believing that Holland was a neutral country. But as many of us know, Hitler invaded Holland, and they were again rounded up and sent to initially Westerbork and ultimately to Bergen-Belsen and murdered in Theresienstadt about a year and 9 months after Elsa Uri died in Auschwitz. We come to a little bit of a happier part of the story now. We have 2 children, the young girl on the right and the little baby boy who's depicted in the picture. And again, we thank John's gossipy grandfather, Ludwig, who tells us that Ilse on the right was the black sheep of the family. Why was she a black sheep? She smoked, she moved out of home, she lived with a man, she studied agriculture, she spoke Yiddish, which was to the German ear bastardized German, and she was a Zionist. And she announced, to her parents' absolute chagrin, that she was going to Palestine. And from Ludwig's memoirs, it is understood that the family didn't know where Palestine was. And they twirled the globe of the world looking for where Palestine was on the map, thinking that she was going to be living in a tent in unsanitary condition amongst the Arabs. Anyway, fast forward a year later, she writes and says that she's married and she has a baby, and the baby's name is Gabby. And the parents wrote back and said, you better send Gabby back to Berlin because you're incapable of raising a child. Well, fortunately, Gabby was not sent back to Berlin because Gabby was raised in Israel, is 80 years old now, lives in Tel Aviv with children and grandchildren, and happy to say, John is in close touch with the family in Israel, the descendants of Ilse. And let's look very quickly at the little baby, Klaus, on the left in the picture. Klaus was able, by good fortune, through John's parents, who were British subjects at this time, to come to London, where he studied architecture. Miraculous things that we hear. He brought out his childhood sweetheart. He was 18 years old at the time and was later able to bring out his high school sweetheart to London. And there are a couple of documents about how he did that in the book. And the amazing thing is that he was raised and raised a family in London. And just go back to the 200 letters that John told you about. The 200 letters that give us so much insight into what was going on during Hitler's rise to power were from his mother, Kader, first from Berlin and subsequently from Amsterdam. So if we look at this little baby, he was actually born in 1918, and his family, children, grandchildren, great-children, are in touch with John. But of course, having been born in 1918, he passed away at the age of 99 last year, 2 years ago. And now, John is going to tell you about a cousin of his.
Very briefly, Bertel Borowski was born in 1924. She's still alive, living in Oakland, California, and she did survive Auschwitz, and she'll tell you in her own words in a second what it was like. But because she was born in 1924, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, she was only 9 years old, and she described to me, and also into her testimony, to show what it was like that overnight her Gentile friends of 9-year-olds stopped talking to her. She was robbed of her childhood, she told me, and of course her education. She couldn't go forward with the schools that Nazis had forbidden Jews to have more education. She was shipped eventually in 1940, I think it was 1943, to Auschwitz, to Theresienstadt first, and then to Auschwitz. As I said, this has a happy ending. She describes what life was like in Auschwitz, and fortunately she was survived, and the American forces liberated Auschwitz in 1945, and Bertel picked herself up, joined her brother and sister in New York, studied to be a nurse, and eventually she achieved what was, at that time, the ultimate Jewish girl's dream. She married a Jewish doctor. He was a Jewish doctor in the American Navy. And they had 2 boys. They were madly in love with each other. They held hands all the time. And they had 2 boys who both became doctors.
We arrived in Auschwitz when it was still dark. There were huge lights, so-called Scheinwerfer, big floodlights that shone on us. And we could see SS in great numbers with dogs, with guns, with whips. We saw prisoners, we saw people in prisoners' uniforms, blue and white stripes, looked quite gaunt and without any expression. In the background, we saw smokestacks belching smoke and flames continuously. We didn't really know what to make of all this. We were put into 2 distinct groups, and one person, one of the SS men, would call our names and direct us left or right, left or right. We had no idea what all this meant. Women were separated from their husbands, wives and husbands separated, women and separated from their children and parents. It was quite bewildering. We were then taken into barracks where we were stripped of our clothing. Everything we owned was taken away. Our hair was shaved, and we were issued prisoners' uniforms. In a matter of minutes, we were stripped of our identities.
Yes, well, it took us a long time to persuade Bertel to tell the story, and in her memoirs, sometimes it's amazing. It's almost like because she's trying to tell her story, she tells it almost in the third person that it happened to somebody else. But we find that extremely moving, and that's how she... Anyway, let's go back a bit in history. We all know that in 1933, Hitler came to power. And if those of you who know about Hitler, at first, Hitler was comic relief. I don't know if any of you have seen Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. But they make a lot of fun of his exaggerated movements and his shouting. But of course, he was no joke. And a lot of people at the time, I read a lot about this, thought that Hitler was a temporary phenomenon. Don't forget, we had the Great Depression. 5 million Germans were unemployed, and Hitler was promising a better future. So over the next few years, there was a build-up of a frenzy of hate against the Jews. And my mother, Helen, who was born in Germany, spoke fluent German, of course, was living in England with my father, decided she was going to go back to Germany, very courageous, and go into the lion's den. And what was the lion's den? It was, of course, Nuremberg. And if any of you have seen pictures of Nuremberg, if you remember, there were swastikas about 60 feet high, all orchestrated by Goebbels. And my mother sat there, and in those 5 days in a large field in Nuremberg, 700,000 Nazis screamed hate against the Jews. And my mother remembers coming back to England, and she had absolutely no doubt what was coming next. The Jews were blamed for everything bad in the world: massive unemployment, the defeat of World War I. Jews were subhumans polluting the German race. And in 1938, the hatred reached a climax in, of course, we all know it's coming up next month, Kristallnacht, November the 8th to 9th, the night of broken glass in 1938.
I'm going to read to you a report by a cousin of John's who was in Berlin on that 8th, 9th of November, 1938. And we look at this Kristallnacht as probably a turning point in the Jews' denial. If anybody and any German Jews were in denial about what was going on, this, of course, we call the wake-up call. And this is what John's cousin Martha wrote the next day to her son, who was in London, her account of this horrific event. I will never forget the St. Bartholomew night as long as I live. The banging, thunder-like crashing and shouting was unbelievable. It destroyed something deep inside of me. It destroyed my belief in humanity. We live among savages, my boy. One saw people unmasked, base and mean, enjoying the destruction. I cannot get rid of the feeling that this was done on order. We are not allowing the children to go to school because the churning Volksseele, that's the soul of the people, could flare up again. And this is just the beginning. Therefore, I beg you at least to save your sister before it is too late. If the conscience of the world does not wake up soon, we are lost. We are not even safe in our homes. The child was so shook up today that she cried bitterly. It hurt my innermost soul, believe me. And for all this, your father lost his arm and carries a wooden arm. The hand he lost wore the iron ring with the inscription from the Germans, the fatherland's thanks. So we get this feeling about the soul of the people. Rachel Levin spoke about there's a deeper malaise in the soul of the German people. Martha's writing about her fear of the soul of the people flaring up again. And just to follow up with at least some form of a happier ending is that this young girl was able to be got out of Berlin by her brother in England. She was sent to London on the Kindertransport 4 months later in March 1939. She herself, this young girl, the Kindertransport transport was Anne Fox, who became a journalist and has written very extensively about the Holocaust.
Well, this slide really tells the whole story. On the left is the Great Synagogue of Berlin, built in the 1860s. And if you look at it, you see the proud towers, and it speaks of the importance of the German Jewish community and how they felt about their community. And on the right is the same place, the same synagogue after Kristallnacht. You see all the shards on the floor. Nothing left. The comfortable world was turned upside down, and there you have the children, and we'll tell you about their fate. So all four at the bottom. There they were. Ludwig, my grandfather, he, as we all know, survived. He went to London and spent 24 years in lonely exile. He hardly spoke English. I knew him very vaguely, but we really couldn't communicate. But he died at the age of 93. On the right is his younger brother Hans, who was the gastroenterologist and also did a lot with x-rays, which were just coming in. And Ludwig Hunt despaired in 1937 because Hitler said no Jews could be doctors anymore. There were no Jewish doctors anymore. So he committed suicide and he took an overdose of pills. Elsa, we've dealt with. Des has talked about her. She was shipped off straight to Birkenau. She was over 65, and if you were over 65, you went straight to the gas chambers. And Kata and her family, the 5 of them, fled to Holland, mistakenly thinking that there would be safety in Holland. And of course, the Germans invaded Holland and treated the Jews exactly the same way as they had in Germany. I'd like to summarize what we've told you. I'm going to come over here. We're going to summarize what we've told you in the last hour. First of all, we've tried to tell you the story of the Holocaust through a different way, through getting to know individual members, and we think that that's probably making it more real to us. We get to know these German Jews as individuals, such as Elsa, Kata, Bertel, going about their daily lives much as we do. And suddenly, they're faced with the horrors of living under the Nazis, being banned from daily life before being rounded up and then shipped off and exterminated. And in these letters, which I've read, there are 200, I haven't read all of them, but you feel the panic. And in one letter, which I found particularly moving, Kata, the younger sister, complains. She says, here we are, we have to go shopping, we have to send the kids to school, and we play cards. And there was a sort of German version of bridge. And she said, here we are, spending hours playing card games, while outside the world is shutting us out. Very, very moving. And we have these letters which you could cry just thinking of what happened. Anyway, they were desperately trying to get out of Germany. Should we go to Shanghai? Should we go to Cuba? Should we go to Bogota? Anywhere that would take them. And of course, we know that many countries shut them out. Their passports were taken away. And Kata writes in one letter, I've got my youngest son living in London. I've got Ilse living in Palestine. And I've got my other daughter we've got Kata living in Amsterdam. So she had 3 children overseas, and the police, without any explanations, just said, we're taking your passport away, you can't have it back. So that's how they were living. So we feel their pain and their panic. We cry with them as these people are herded into cattle cars, no longer human beings, to certain death. And I think it's important to remember that these are not remote ancestors from, the Middle Ages. These are the brothers and sisters of my grandparents. And the lesson that Des and I have taken from this is, first of all, you could be a good American, but don't forget your roots. And many German Jews did forget their roots. And secondly, if there is hate, let's be vigilant, not just against the Jews, but this is a much bigger thing. Hate against anybody, we should be vigilant. We ourselves asked some questions. We're going to open the floor now to questions and comments, but we ourselves wanted to tell you the sort of questions that we were asking ourselves. Were the Germans always Jew haters? Was the Holocaust inevitable? Why did it happen in Germany? How come many Jews didn't see what was happening until it was too late? And finally, we try to imagine ourselves living at that time, and we ask ourselves, what would you have done? What would you have done if you were living at that time? So that really concludes what we were trying to tell you, and we would love any comments or any questions that anybody has. Does anybody have any comments?
Why the Jews? In other words, you get the feeling that, first of all, I assume that this was Hitler's idea, rather than other people. But assuming it was Hitler's main idea mainly, why did he feel that he had to destroy the Jews? Because you had the feeling that destroying the Jews was almost more important to him than winning the war, because he obviously was detracting from his military forces and his army in order to go about the extermination of the Jews. Why did he pick the Jews?
Well, it's not him only.
Des, is it okay if I'll answer this one? That's a very good question. Let me just give you a very short history lesson. There was no Germany until 1870. In 1870, the 26 little principalities of Germany united to become Germany. At the same time, they elected this Kaiser, who was going to be the leader of Germany, and they invented this myth of Aryans, because everybody knows what Aryans is, right? That way back in the mists of time, the pure German race had existed. These were the Saxons, and these were the, Roman time of the Roman Empire. And this was actually untrue, but it was a myth. So with the rise of Germany came this philosophy of purity, that the German race was superior to everybody else, and that the Jews didn't belong in Germany. Now, I'm not sure I've answered all your question, but the other answer is, of course, that Hitler took the Jews as a scapegoat. They unified people. It was an easy sell. We talked about how the Jews were viewed by the average German. Every time there was a stock market crash, it was the fault of the Jews. So the answer is, I think that Hitler used that and communism to beat up his opponents and to unify Germany.
I just want to congratulate you. It's a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
One of the things about why Hitler hated the Jews so much, what I had read was that he had a grandmother who had worked for a wealthy Jewish family, and that she had an affair with the son of the owner of the family, and she got pregnant.
And
She had a child. This is a story that I heard, and that she had a child out of wedlock, and of course this was Hitler's grandmother. So supposedly that's one of the stories that I heard. The other thing that's remarkable about this story is, excuse me, the parallel nature between the Jews who were living in Ukraine, the Ashkenazi Jews, as opposed to the German Jews. And you were showing things that because my ancestors were from Ukraine, and they didn't have any kind of a life like that at that time. It was amazing to see. And the German Jews were, like you said, they thought that they were impregnable. They thought they were superior. And of course, they didn't look up to the Ashkenazi Jews, look down at them always.
But they're Ashkenazis also.
That woman.
Oh, Bertel, yes. Wasn't that moving when she talks about her coming to Auschwitz? Well, I think some people were lucky. She was young. I asked her that question, and she said, some of us survived, we had the will to survive, and some just gave up. And I think that's the short answer. And she was young and strong, and she wanted to live. And of course, she had a
They were
wonderful life.
gassed. How did they escape the gas?
So I am a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and I was raised to know that no matter how good it is, even in the United States, I'm here 40 years. I came in 1980. I had 2 little children. And in the beginning, it was amazing. It was the promised land. There wasn't anything, and I grew up in Israel. Today, I can tell you that even in the United States, after what happened in Pittsburgh and in all these places, I can feel it, that it's so changed. I was most of the time in Pittsburgh, and I own properties. The attitude was wonderful when you came in. There wasn't even an issue. Today, it's so different. There's all those groups of redheads, and you don't have to go to Europe to see that there is always that wave. When it's too good for the Jews, they make the money, they get into the stock market, you hear about Madoff, you hear about everything else, and it's all to blame the Jews. And I see the pattern here, I really do, and I don't feel comfortable. And I was joking to my son, we should go and buy some property in Australia or something, I don't know what. But it's like, I don't feel the same at all. And I always have my eyes open, I cannot live in naivete. That's something that was taken away from me from childhood, because I was raised with people that saw the worst. So that's just what I wanted to help with.
This is a tough question, and I'm just going to ask you, is there any way of discussing theologically the Holocaust, or do you think that's off topic, or out of bounds?
How did God allow this to
Yeah,
happen?
a perennial question. Do you have any thoughts, or do you want to pursue that?
It seems. It seems to me that the survivors, and Des, I'll ask you to answer too. It seems to me the survivors fell into two categories. One who said, how could God allow this to happen? And I don't believe in God. What kind of God would allow 6 million Jews to be slaughtered? And there are other people who actually, for some reason, they restored their faith, or they found a way to believe in the future, and they see that the Jews did survive and they flourish. So it's a tough question, but if you read the memoirs, some of the great memoirs of the concentration camps,
Yes.
Many of them just gave up and said,
Right. I kind of saw, as John has spoken about, some became very orthodox and some became atheists.
I just would like to mention one more thing, Des, if we could bring up the slide about how many Jews did leave Germany. Yeah, here we are. I thought this might interest you. One of the questions we asked was, how come so many Jews didn't see what was coming until too late? Let me give you some figures. In 1900, there were 180,000 Jews in Berlin. By 1933, there were approximately the same number, 160,000. So by 1939, there were only 80,000. So you see that 50% of the Jews in Berlin did in fact leave. So it's not really fair to say that the Jews didn't see what was happening. Many Jews did. Many went anywhere they could go. The other thing that I wanted to mention was the question we asked ourselves is, why did it happen in Germany? And I've been reading about it, trying to understand why in Germany. Don't forget that anti-Semitism was just as virulent in France. Everybody remember Dreyfus? Yes. And in England, we had our share, and in other countries, especially in Poland and Russia. So it wasn't that the Germans were the only ones who didn't like the Jews, and that's an understatement. So the question is, why did it happen in Germany? And this book, which I recommend, The Pity of It All, by an Israeli, who I really have used for this talk, he said the following: in Germany, which was created in 1870, it was a small elite of the Prussian army that ruled Germany. There was no real democracy. In France, they had the French Revolution, the people had spoken. In England, there was Parliament, and we'd had democracy in England since the time of Cromwell, which was in the 1600s. So there was a tradition of democracy. In Germany, any tolerance of the Jews was imposed by the Kaiser. In other words, I don't want to do my German impersonation, but he said, you will tolerate the Jews. It didn't come from up, from like in France, from below, it was imposed from above. So the theory, and I see some merit in this theory, is that the Germans never really accepted the Jews voluntarily, but it was imposed on them to give them rights. But underneath it all, and there's the wonderful book, The Invisible Wall, which says that the Jews were never fully accepted by the Germans, and that's why it was right for Hitler to come along and do what he did. Yes.
I have not been to Germany, but Jewish people who visit Germany come back with two distinctly different opinions. One will say, look how they remembered the Holocaust. They have memorials, they have statues, they've given reparations. Look at how nice they've been to the Jews. And then there's the other side who say anti-Semitism is still just as bad as Germany. It's just quiet and hidden, but it's still there. Which is the truth?
It's in this country. It's here in this country.
Anybody like to comment on that? No. All right, I'll tell you what happened. But if you look at the slide, after the war there were a few thousand Jews left, almost nobody. But you know who came to Berlin after the war? The Israelis.
That's what I was going to say.
Yes.
I have Israeli
The
friends.
Israelis are very prominent in Berlin. And my God, I'm a bit torn. When I grew up, my parents wouldn't buy a Mercedes. Right? Everybody remember that?
Yes.
And today, sorry.
Yeah, I had a Porsche, and my grandmother would never go into the Porsche. She said, I don't know whose hair is in the cushion of the chair.
Right. So, and then of course, time marches on, and I'm sure many Jews wouldn't even hesitate to buy a Mercedes, right? It just changed. Now, the question is, have the Germans changed? And you may not agree with this, but I think that there's a whole generation of Germans that feel terrible about what happened. There were a lot of young poets. There's a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Germany. So my answer is a sort of mixed answer. Yes, after the war there were generations, at least one or two generations of people who felt terrible and wanted to forget the war, and the Germans did at least acknowledge. Let me tell you about the French. The French denied what happened, the resistance. They made up all of the wonderful things. That the French were terrible during the war. The French absolutely collaborated with the Germans. But they made up this myth of the French resistance. I'm not saying there wasn't a resistance, but in Germany, they did at least acknowledge the terrible thing. And in fact, Des and I were in Lithuania. Take Lithuania. It's only in 1900 did the Lithuanian government acknowledge what had happened and the Lithuanians had been responsible for killing. Is that my right, Des?
2000, not 1900.
Sorry,
They
2000.
acknowledged what had happened. The Lithuanians, they have a memorial every year. I think it's on Yom HaShoah. And they have the Prime Minister speaking. I've got some of it in one of my books there, how they apologize and regret and want to make amends. And I have to say, I agree with what you're saying, is there are very divergent emotions by going to Germany. John, I think, feels more comfortable than I do. I was raised in a family whose Lithuanian grandparents came to South Africa. My parents would never buy anything German, except a German piano. But there is such almost a dichotomy. It's just like the survivors. Some became very orthodox, some became unbelievers. I don't feel comfortable in Germany. John feels comfortable in Germany. I don't. But I think that it's just wonderful to be able to air our differing opinions, because this is what we're about. We're not all the same. Do we call it time out?
How'd you meet?
Oh, us? Well, we have been significant others for